Alright, this video is going to walk you through some ideas from Hurley 1.3 on the distinctions between types of arguments. But let me just back up here and kind of remind you where we've been so far in sections 1.1 and 1.2. In sections 1.1, you were introduced to the idea of statements. 1.1 statements are roughly propositions or claims that can be either true or false. Now, if you remember back to the intro to philosophy videos a little while ago, I talked a little bit about epistemology. And part of epistemology is the question of what is truth and what makes something true. My own view is truth is really simple. Truth is simply the matter of an idea or a claim or a statement corresponding to reality. So if I say something like, my keys are on the desk, and I text that to my roommate, and my roommate gets that text, they can take that idea and look on my desk and see if my keys are there. Or I can take the idea and look and see if my keys are there. And if my belief or my statement or my proposition or my idea matches how things are, that is, if the keys are really on the desk, then my claim is true. My statement is true. My belief is true. That's what truth is. Truth is a matter of the correspondence or the matching of an idea with how things really are. Now, there are different views of truth, and I'm not going to get into all of those in this video. But truth is really simple, and everyone knows what it is. I think a lot of times people have a hard time describing it. There's a lot of confusion about truth today in contemporary life, but I think it's quite simple. But anyway, statements, according to Hurley in section 1.1, are either true or false. Okay, so that's pretty simple. In section 1.2, we talked about groups of statements. 1.2, groups of statements. And there are two types of groups of statements, arguments and non-arguments, right? So this is this key distinction here. And what's the key notion or the key difference between an argument and a non-argument? Arguments attempt to prove something. Arguments attempt to prove something. That's just what an argument is. A non-argument, it has no attempt to prove anything. No attempt to prove anything. Non-arguments don't try and prove anything. Remember, arguments consist of premises, and conclusions. And this attempt to prove is that which occurs in that rational inference. Okay. So the last section in 1.2, you were given some ideas about how to distinguish between arguments and non-arguments. And then Hurley gave you some different types of non-arguments that you were supposed to go over. Okay. In this section, in 1.3, we're going to look at this different types of arguments. So now, once we've got what arguments amounts to, or what arguments are, and we've identified them, then we can look at two different types of arguments. Deductive arguments, and inductive arguments. These are two different types of arguments. So in this section, you're going to learn the difference between these two types of arguments. Okay. Just off the bat, though, let me just say briefly one way to distinguish between these two. And if you notice, if you just look at these words, if you just look at the word deduction and inductive and deductive, what do these two words, just the words themselves, have in common? Well, they both got this root duct, right? And you know what a duct is, right? It's a little. I'm sorry. I have to. This is just a dad joke that just needs to be brought out here. You know what a duct is, right? It's a little bird that goes quack, quack, quack. Not even a courtesy laugh. No, nobody's courtesy laughing. So in the course evals, thankfully for this course, in the course evals, there are no categories for the quality of the jokes offered in this class. If there were, I probably would have never been invited back to teach another class here at the university. All right. So a duct is a duck is a little bird that goes quack, quack, quack. A duct is not. There are no ducks harmed in the making of duct tape. Let me just say that again. There are no ducks harmed in the making of duct tape. Okay. I'm sorry. I'll just keep going with this. But you're paying me to teach critical thinking, not give bad jokes. All right. So a duct, right, is like a tube or an aqueduct, right? So a trench or a channel that water flows through, or an air duct, right, where your air conditioning air is pushed through it, or heating, or your tear ducts, right, where tears come out of from your eyes. A duct is like a tube or some sort of a channel or something by means of which something moves from one place to another. A duct. Okay. So now there's different types of ducts, right? So this first type of duct, a deduction, day versus in, right? So this just these prefixes here, day and in, will give you an indication of the difference between a deduction and an induction. Okay, so a day, like in Spanish, soy de California or something, right? Means from or out of. So a deduction draws premises. Sorry, draws a conclusion out of the premises of an argument. Whereas an induction kind of draws a conclusion, draws a conclusion into the premises, or draws the conclusion into the premises. In other words, a deduction will take premises and then draw information out of it, whereas an induction, it will take premises and put information into a conclusion. Okay? The premises, maybe I should put this slightly differently. In an induction, the premises draw information into the conclusion. That's probably a better way to put it. A deduction draws evidence out of the premises, and an induction kind of puts information from the premises into the conclusion. All right. So now that's just a brief way of putting this. In the next section, we're going to look at different ways to evaluate deductions and inductions, but we'll come to that in the next section. Okay, so here in 1.3, Hurley again tries to give the distinction between deduction and induction. Now he puts it a slightly different sort of way. So let me read this to you, because I think sometimes hearing it, in addition to hearing it read, reading it and hearing it read, I think can help. Okay. So let's look at this definition of what a deduction amounts to. Okay, so here's the definition of a deduction. A deduction is an argument incorporating the claim that it's impossible for the premises to be true. It's impossible for the conclusion to be false given that the premises are true. Let me say that again. A deduction is an argument incorporating the claim that it's impossible for the conclusion to be false given that the premises are true. Now notice this. It's a claim, right? Just like for an argument to be an argument, it doesn't have to be a good argument. So too, for an argument to be a deduction, it doesn't have to be a good deduction. Okay, let me give you an example. See if I can give you an example of a deduction. Let me just show you a brief example of a deduction. All right, so let's look at a couple of examples of some deductions. These are deductions, okay? So let's look at these examples. Let's look at this first one here. So this first example, here it is. All dogs are mammals, all poodles are dogs, so all poodles are mammals. Now, again, this is a deduction. It meets the criteria for what a deduction amounts to, according to Hurley, right? Again, what is a deduction supposed to do? A deduction is supposed to incorporate the idea or claim that if the premises are true, it's impossible for the conclusion to be false. Okay? So just look at this argument. Argument 1. Forget about argument 2 for a second. Just look at argument 1. In this argument, if these are true, does this conclusion have to be true? Yeah, it does. There's no way around it. If all dogs are mammals and all poodles are dogs, then all poodles are mammals, right? Now, if you want to see this, you can see this clearly if you want to draw a diagram, right? So here's the inside circle represents dogs. The outside circle is mammals, right? So this diagram says that all dogs are mammals. Everything in the dog category is in the mammal category. And then if you put poodles right inside here, poodles are dogs, that's the second premise, then where must the poodles be? They have to be in that mammal category, right? This is simple kind of deduction here. So it's impossible, if those premises are true, that conclusion can't be false. Now this is claiming that, but does it have to be that way? No, not necessarily, right? This argument here is still a deduction. This is still a deduction, the second argument. This is not a very good one, but it's still deductive, right? If you notice in a deduction, right? Let's look at this first one again. Look at this first argument. Is there anything new in the conclusion that's not in the premises? No. There's nothing new in that conclusion. The first premise is about dogs and mammals. The second premise is about poodles and dogs. The third premise, the conclusion, the third statement is about poodles and mammals. There's nothing new. The conclusion is drawn out of, it's drawn from the premises. And that's the main idea of what a deduction is. Look at the second argument. Second argument is still a deduction. It's just not a very good deduction. Now, its goodness is a little different than you might think. The structure of the argument is good, but the content's not. All fish are reptiles, all poodles are fish, so all poodles are reptiles. Again, this is an argument in which there's a claim made that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. But in fact, not all these premises are true, and we'll look at that in a moment. But it still makes that sort of claim. All right, now let's look at this third argument. This third argument here, down at the bottom of the screen, this is still a deduction. This one's good. This one's not so good. This one's not very good either. This one's not good because it's got false premises. But to be a deduction, all you have to do is say, hey, I'm a deduction, and I'm trying to prove that if these premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Now, argument number 2 fails because the premises are false. Not all fish are reptiles, and not all poodles are fish. In fact, it's because none of them are, right? Okay, not just because some of them aren't. But number 3, all dogs are mammals, all poodles are mammals, so all dogs are poodles. Now you might think, well, those premises are both true. All dogs are mammals, and all poodles are mammals. But what about the conclusion? Does the conclusion follow? No, it doesn't. No, this is not a good argument. This is not good. And we'll learn in the next section why it's not good. I mean, for now, I think you can pretty kind of easily, or at least possibly easily, think that, look, all dogs are mammals, that's true. All poodles are mammals, but not all dogs have to be poodles, right? All you have to do to show that that's false is to bring out a Rottweiler, Labrador Retriever, or I don't know, Chihuahua or whatever, Saint Bernard, whatever your favorite dog breed is, right? So, but this is still a deduction. So to be a deduction, you don't have to be a good deduction. You just have to have deductive structure, and you have to say, look, I'm trying to prove that if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true as well. Okay, even if you fail in that attempt, like arguments 2 and 3 do, this one's valid but unsound. We'll learn what those terms are in the next section. This last one, number 3, is invalid. It's invalid. This one's invalid. Why? Because those premises don't actually prove that conclusion. And we'll learn about that technique. For now, we're just looking at the distinction between deduction and induction. But notice again the notion of deduction. right? Here, this is the idea that in this, right, this conclusion in number 3, there's nothing new in that conclusion. Dogs and poodles are both in the premises. There's nothing new. But now let's take a look now at some inductions. Let's look at some inductions. Okay, so here's a couple examples of some inductions. So let's look at this. Let's look at this first example. This first one here. Example 1. Premise. There's traffic at the 7815 interchange when I drive to work at 7:30 in the morning. And premise 2, it's been like that for every day for the last 15 years I've had this job. So probably tomorrow when I drive to work, there will be traffic at that spot. Right? Now, that's an induction. Why? Because it's making the claim that if these premises were true, the conclusion is likely to be true. Remember, it's claiming that the conclusion is likely to be true. Likely to be true. Or probably going to be true. But does it have to be true? No, it doesn't. Why? Because maybe tomorrow when I drive to work, I forgot I'm driving on a Sunday or a federal holiday or something. Driving on Christmas Day, right? It's like, well, there's nobody on the freeway. It's a major holiday, and it's a weekend, right? So that doesn't have to be true, but it's probably true. So this is an induction. If you notice that this induction, there's something new in that. There's something new in the conclusion that's not present in the premises, right? In the premises. This conclusion is about the future. It's about tomorrow, right? There's nothing about tomorrow in the premises. Those are all about the past. So in inductions, there's something read into the conclusion from the premises that distinguishes an induction from a deduction. Now, this is a pretty good prediction, probably. If there's been traffic at that spot for the last 15 years, probably the next day that you go, there will be traffic. Now, does it have to be true? No, but it's probably true. Probably true. But look at this one. So this number 1 here is an induction. Number 2, this is also a deduction. It's also it's also an induction. It's an induction. And if you look at this argument, premise 1 says this. There was a herd of cows at the 7815 interchange when I drove to work yesterday at 7:30 a.m. That happened only once during the last 15 years. So probably there will be a herd of cows at the 7815 interchange every morning for the next 100 years. Now you might be thinking, that's a really bad argument. Yeah, but we're not evaluating this argument. We know it's an argument. Why? Because the premises try to prove something in the conclusion. That's what makes it an argument. But it's just not a very good argument. But what kind of argument is it? Is it an induction or a deduction? Well, what is an induction supposed to do? Let me just take you back over to the text, right? For an argument to be inductive, all you have to have is the claim that it's improbable, not impossible, but improbable that the conclusion be false given that the premises are true. Now, you might be looking at this, you might be thinking, well, look, Tim, that argument, this conclusion, number 2, this is really improbable. It's a pretty low probability of that happening. Right, but that doesn't matter because I'm not asking if this is a good induction. I'm just asking whether it's an induction. And the answer is yes. This argument tries to prove that the conclusion is likely. Now, does it succeed in that attempt to prove that conclusion? No. But it's still trying to prove that the conclusion is highly probable. Not impossible, just highly probable. So what makes it an induction? That attempt to prove something in terms of its probabilistic outcome. Okay? Deductions don't do that, right? Look at the difference between these two arguments here, the induction and the deduction. Let me get these on the screen where you can see them. Right? This deduction is absolute. This induction is just probable, right? If all dogs are mammals and all poodles are dogs, then all poodles have to be mammals. There's no way out of it. That's just how the logic works. But on this one, on the induction, even if those premises are true, that conclusion could still be false. That's what makes it an induction. It's just a probabilistic inference. Okay. Hopefully this distinction helps. Let me show you some examples of a deduction, and then contrast that with an induction. Let me show you some examples. These are again some goofy examples. Here's a goofy example of a deduction. All right, that might have been a little hard to hear on the audio what was being said, but this is still a deduction. This argument is still a deduction. And the argument went like this. Premise 1, all dogs on the floor are dogs that belong to this man. Premise 2, all dogs belong to this man are dogs that don't bite. Conclusion, all dogs on this floor are dogs that don't bite. Now, if that were an argument, which it is, it would be it would have the structure of a deduction. The conclusion, notice the conclusion, all dogs on this floor are dogs that don't bite, that same stuff is in the premises. Dogs that don't bite, dogs on the floor, right? This has still got that deductive structure. The conclusion is drawn out of the premises. Unfortunately, it's not a good deduction because one of the premises is false, that the dog on the floor belonged to this man, right? The man behind the counter. So this is still a deduction. It's just not a very good one, but it's a deduction. All right, let me show you another illustration of an induction that I think you might find helpful in seeing an inductive structure. Another goofy example. Okay, so it's one of my favorite films of the late 20th century. But this is an induction, right? There's a conclusion that's inferred that doesn't have to absolutely follow, but it's a probabilistic inference, maybe a prediction, right? So the argument is something like premise 1, the odds of us being together are 1 in a million. Premise 2, there is a chance that we will be together. Therefore, the conclusion is something like it's very probable and likely that we will be together. Now, this is still an induction. Even though it's not a very good one, it's still an induction. Why? What makes it an induction? Well, this notion of probability and likelihood, right? Remember, to be an induction doesn't mean you have to be a good induction. It just has to incorporate the claim that it's improbable the conclusion be false, given that the premises are true. Or another way to put it is, assuming that the premises are true, it's likely or probable that the conclusion will be true as well. Okay? Same thing for a deduction. To be a deduction doesn't mean to be a good deduction. It just means that the argument is asserting something. And it's asserting that if these premises are true, then the conclusion has to be true, must be true, is absolutely going to follow with strict logical necessity. Okay, that's again another key distinction between deduction and induction. Deductions make claims. They try to argue in a certain sort of way, namely that the conclusion will absolutely follow. And whereas inductions, claims are more probabilistic that the conclusion will follow, or tries to show that the conclusion doesn't, even though it doesn't have to follow, it's likely to. Okay. So the rest of this chapter here gives some information on different types of deductions and different types of inductions. So let me just say a word about a few of these. Deductive arguments forms are arguments based on math, definitions, syllogisms. A syllogism just is like a reasoning together. So like an if-then syllogism, disjunctive syllogisms, and I think categorical syllogisms are those. Yeah, here's categorical syllogisms. Right, these are the ones that I gave about the dogs and the poodles are categorical syllogisms. Again, they all have this structure that if the premises are true, the conclusion is claiming at least to follow with strict logical necessity. Whereas inductive argument forms, in some way, Hurley says the conclusions go beyond the premises, right? So when I make an inference about traffic patterns, I'm basing it off the past, but I'm predicting something about the future. That's what the in part is, right? Remember, inductions read something into the conclusion from the premises. They don't just draw out. So predictions, arguments by analogy, we'll look at some weak analogies later in the semester. Generalizations, we'll look at the hasty generalization fallacy, arguments from authority, arguments based on signs. All of these are going to be causal inferences. All of these are going to be types of inductions. Okay, you can look at the details in the text on those. All right. I think that's another. I think that's probably all I want to say about this statement. Again, on the summary part here on page 39, there's a key claim, right? To distinguish, I'm going to just read this, so just follow along, or you can read it yourself again. To distinguish deductive from inductive arguments, you attempt to evaluate the strength of the argument's inferential claim. How strongly the conclusion is claimed to follow. Claimed to follow, right? An argument can claim that it's deductive and be a bad deduction. But if it claims to follow that strong deductive form, then it's going to be a deduction and not an induction. Okay? All right, so just make sure you pay attention to that, and you can review some of the highlights that I pointed out in this chapter. Otherwise, thanks for listening.
Stay psyched, Grom. You.